Bonjour French 1, this is your section 5.1 video about two fairly different topics. On the front side of your notes you have the information about asking questions using question words in French, and on the back we're going to cover adverbs, or at least some more ways of asking questions and some more adverbs, because this is all stuff that we have covered previously in the year and we're now delving deeper into the subjects. So let's start with the asking questions side of your notes. The first thing that we need to talk about is what we know so far, and that is so far this year we know how to ask yes or no questions. There's two different ways of asking yes or no questions in the French language. The first way is by changing the intonation of your voice, which basically means that you raise your voice at the end of the sentence to signal that it's a question. You do this all the time in English, but in French, it's the difference between saying the statement "tu joues au baseball," you play baseball, versus "tu joues au baseball," you play baseball, and all of a sudden it becomes a question just by the way your voice goes up at the end of the sentence. If, however, you'd like to make it a little more clear and not have to emphasize the fact that it's a question by raising your voice, you can use the French word est que. Remember, est que doesn't necessarily have any meaning. Est que just tells you that basically what you have here is a question. It's a gigantic flashing sign in your sentence that says, hey, no matter how this person's speaking, whether they raise their voice or not, this here is a question. So in the same way that you could ask, you play baseball, you could just say the same sentence and put est que at the beginning. It's still asking the same thing, but you don't necessarily have to change the intonation of your voice. Est que tu joues au baseball just means, do you play baseball? Same thing. What we're learning about in this section is how to ask open-ended questions. So instead of just asking, you play baseball, do you read, do you like to do this, which are all yes or no questions, we're going to learn how to ask open-ended questions. So if you're trying to get to know somebody and what they like to do, you don't have to go through 10 different sports saying, do you like hockey? No. Do you like baseball? No. Do you like tennis? No. You can just ask, what sport do you like? But that requires the question word what. And it requires a certain formula or a certain setup for that question. So basically what you have here is the formula for forming a formal question in French. I say formal because every now and then you'll see something slightly different than this strict formula, and that's because you know how people are. They don't always speak in the very perfect, grammatically perfect way. So the formula is to use a question word, as in who, what, when, where, why, and how, and they're all down here in French. We'll go through them here in just a second and give you a chance to pronounce them. Followed by the word est que, because remember, every time a French person sees the word est que, they know right away it's a question. So it's really nice to have that there as just a blaring sign that this is a question. And then you go on with the subject and the verb and the rest of your sentence, whatever it might be. So you can, instead of just say, do you play baseball, you can say, when do you play baseball, why do you play baseball, where do you play baseball, with whom do you play baseball. But the bottom line is you're going to need the where and the when and the with whom and all of that, followed by the you and the play baseball and est que there in the middle. And we'll do some examples here in a minute because I know just talking about it doesn't solidify the idea. First things first, though, you have to know your question words, and that's really the only new part to this section, is knowing that whenever you form that question, you don't just put est que at the beginning. Just putting est que at the beginning makes it yes or no. You also then have to insert a question word before it to make it that open-ended who, what, when, where, why question. So I'm going to go ahead and go through these with you. I'll pause after each one to give you a chance to repeat. The question word for when is quand. The word for why is pourquoi. The word for what is technically quoi, but what you'll see it most often as is it'll be attached to est que, and it'll just look like a QU, and you get that qu'est-ce que word, which we've seen whenever we've learned certain sentences and certain actual phrases in different sections, but now you know where it comes from. Technically it's the word quoi, but it's been shortened and gotten rid of some of the vowels so it can be attached to est que. But if you see it as just a QU, it is just the word what. Où is the word where. Comment is the word how. Qui is the word who. And avec qui is for with whom, as in who do you do it with, not just who is that person, but with whom do you do an activity. So keeping that in mind, we have a couple of questions, because the thing is you really want to be able to think something in English and then be able to say it in French. So if you have a friend that says that they play soccer and you want to know where they play soccer, keep in mind that formula. Question word, est que, subject, verb / rest of the sentence. So if you want to say where do you play soccer, don't try to translate it word for word and open up your dictionary and look for where and do and you. Instead, keep the formula in mind. Think about what your question word is. Your question word is the word where. The word where in French is où. The formula says the next phrase needs to be est que, Then you need your subject. I'm asking where do you play soccer, so you is tu. And then when you talk about playing soccer, play soccer is jouer au foot. Notice that I changed the ending because we do need to do the tu ending, so you're not saying where do you to play soccer. We want to say where do you play soccer and make it agree with you. So I dropped the ER and added the ES. Où est-ce que tu joues au foot is where do you play soccer. Now before you get upset, I realize that it just took us a solid 60 seconds just to figure out a simple question like where do you play soccer. This is where you have to kind of be diligent and dedicated and willing to spend some time on this. It'll take you a while before this feels natural in the French language, but the more times you practice going through the motions of remembering the formula and plugging things in, the better chance that it'll actually become more natural for you because you'll get used to doing it. So stick with me. I know it takes a while to get through each one of these, but it's going to help you figure it out in the end. So when you talk about why does he do theater, again, don't try to translate it word for word. Think about the formula. Start with your question word, which is why, and if you look back at your notes, it's pourquoi. Then the formula says you need an est que. Then you need your subject. The person we're talking about in this sentence is he, so I use il. And then to do theater is faire du théâtre, but again, you have to make sure that you conjugate faire. If you check your notes from the very beginning of this section, the il form of faire is fait. Pourquoi est-ce qu'il fait du théâtre is why does he do theater. If you wanted to ask when do we swim, you have to, again, follow the formula. The question word for when is quand. Your next step of the formula is est-ce que. The people we're asking about in this one is when do we swim, so the French word for we is nous. And then remember the verb for to swim is nager, but I'm going to change that ending, and don't forget when you have a G followed by an O and S, you leave the E in there, so it's not nageant, it's nageant. But that is the nous form of nager, which is the verb for to swim. Altogether, you end up with quand est-ce que nous nageons, which is when do we swim. There are a couple of exceptions to this. I'm not telling you this so much because I'm expecting you to remember it, as if you see this in a reading or something we do in class, I don't want you to think that the book or whoever wrote the activity or the sentence is doing it wrong. If by chance the question is followed by a form of the word être, remember être is the word for to be. It's those je suis, tu es means I am, you are, il est means he is, use elle for a girl. Nous sommes, we are, vous êtes is plural or formal, use ils sont for groups of men or mixed, ils sont for groups of girls. Remember those forms? Anyway, if you want to say something like followed by the word is or am and are, those are the words for être, right? If you want to say something like where is your sister or how is your cousin, if you're using the words is or am and are right after the word or the question word, whether it's where or how or when, you don't actually have to put est que in there. And then the other thing is if you use the word qui, which is the word who, followed directly by a verb. So if you want to say something like who plays or who does or who eats or who reads, if you're using an action word directly after it and you're not using like something like who is your cousin or something else, if it's just an action word, the word like play or the word like do here, then you don't actually have to put est que in there. Qui joue de la guitare is who plays the guitar. Qui fait les devoirs is who does the homework. So keep in mind that if you see something that does look slightly different, don't let it throw you off. Don't think that there's a mistake made. It's just that they're following those exceptions, but they are kind of hard to remember right off the bat. I'd rather you focus on remembering the formula, and you'll never go wrong when you do that. So when you flip over your paper, total change here, but I didn't want to have you queue up two separate videos, so I figured we just squeeze it all in together. We're also going to talk about adverbs. So when you talk about how do you play a sport, like as in how good or how well you play a sport, you can use these adverbs to describe it because adverbs add information to verbs. They say how a verb or action is done. They can be used as in adverbs of frequency, which we learned earlier in the year by saying how often something is done, like souvent, which is often, de temps en temps, from time to time, rarement, which is rarely, toujours, which is always, and régulièrement, which is regularly. By the way, I skipped through those quickly because I know we've covered them earlier in the year. Or what we'd rather talk about in this section is talking about how you do something, whether it's words like slowly or quickly or nicely or well or poorly. A lot of adverbs tend to be ly words, li words. The cool thing about the French language is it actually kind of has an equivalent to that. Basically, the ending ment is the French equivalent of ly in the English language. Now, it doesn't work all the time, but in the case of most adverbs, it does. So here's how you take an adverb and make it in French. Basically, you take whatever the describing word is, like the word serious here, sérieux. And to make it seriously, you don't just get to add the ment. You actually have one other step in between. You take the feminine form. Now, sérieux has an irregular one with the E-U-S-E ending. Sérieuse was serious for a girl, if you'll remember way back in chapter 2. And then if you take that feminine form and you add a ment to it, then you get seriously. So in the English language, you just take the word serious, you add an ly, and you get the adverb seriously to say how you work or how you study or whatever it might be. In French, you have to take that word for serious, make sure that you're taking the feminine form and add ment to it. Do notice that they say that most adverbs in the French language are usually placed after the verb, and this example rather shows you that. Le professeur travaille sérieusement means the teacher works seriously. So we'll do a couple of examples of how to make some adjectives adverbs, as in you take something that describes a person, place, or thing, and you change it to its feminine form, add the ment, and all of a sudden it's describing how things are done instead. So for example, you take the word nice, which is gentil, and if you want to say not that the person is nice, but that they do things nicely, and you want to take it from nice to nicely, the way you do that in the French language is not just to add an ly like we do it in the English language. You change it to the feminine form, which is gentil, and you add a ment to it. Gentiment would mean nicely. If you want to take the word easy, and you don't want to say that the test is easy, but I do the test easily, you're talking about how well you did easily working through the test. If you want to take that, you need to take easy, facile, and make it its feminine form, which is kind of a trick question because it already ends in the letter E, and then you add ment to the end, and all of a sudden you go from describing the test as being easy to describing the action of completing the test easily. Facilement means easily. Heureux means happy. In order to say that instead of I am happy in describing a person, place, thing kind of idea, if you want to say that you do things happily, I would happily complete that work for you, Miss D. You have to take the word happy, which is heureux. You have to make it its feminine form, which is heureuse. Again, that kind of weird ending. It's not just adding an E to it, right? And then you add a ment to it. Heureusement is happily. And then finally, I know this is a brand spanking new word for us. We've never seen it before. Rapide. Think about rapid. It means fast or quick. If you take that word and you make it feminine, which is again a trick question because it already ends in the letter E, and you add a ment to it, you then get the word rapidement, which is quickly. Again, adding the ment basically is like adding the ly in English. Now, there are two exceptions to that. You can't take bon and make bonnement for goodly, because let's face it, in the English language you don't say that you do something goodly, you say that you do something well. So just like in the English language how you have the two words good and well, in French you describe a person as being good and you describe an action as being something that you do well, and the word bien is the word for well. Now, in the English language, you can take bad and you can make it badly. In French, they tend to describe a person or a thing as being bad, like maybe the pizza is bad. But then if you want to talk about somebody playing a sport badly, you can't do necessarily mauvaisement. Every now and then you'll see it. The more proper, grammatically correct way is to use the word mal for badly. So I gave you two examples here of il joue bien au tennis, he plays tennis well, and then je fais mal du ski, I do tennis poorly. And again, when I'm translating those, you'll realize that, of course, in the English language, we don't necessarily put the adverb right after the verb, but in French, they do. I know this was a lot of information in a long video. I thank you for staying with me. Don't worry, we'll practice it a lot in class, and it'll start making a lot more sense